This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping take your leadership to the next level. And joining me is perhaps the longest standing Buffalo Sabres fan. Maybe the most committed Buffalo Sabres fan.
And you have to be a Buffalo Sabres
fan. Yeah, and there's only one.
Yeah.
And you occupy
either you're hot
seat.
or you're cold. And I've got a frozen mouth too, so hopefully that's not too distracting.
Yeah, I'll say off the bat, Richard has not been drinking, so if he slurs any words here, it's a total result of a dental procedure.
And I knew I had this podcast recording this afternoon, and they froze my jaw, whatever, and then they got working on it. And this dentist is usually pretty good. Like, I don't feel a lot of pain with him, but I was feeling some pain. It was the drill got going, and I could feel it tickling that nerve. And he's like, he could tell, he said, like, your toes look like they're tied in knots. I'm squirming, and I said, well, I could feel it. And he's like, well, we can give you more pain medicine, but I'm thinking, like, I'll be just slobbering all over myself during the podcast later. Like, we need to develop some awards here on the Leadership Podcast for commitment and dedication. So I just said, how much longer? I can grit my teeth for a few more rounds of the drill, but if it's going to be for a while, let's bring on the pain med. So I did, and
here you are.
Here I am. I'm still feeling it.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you made the effort and suffered through that dental procedure.
Well, I'm trying. I can honestly say, spending time with you is better than being under the drill with the dentist.
Well, I am so grateful to hear that, and it just warms my.
I hope you're touched by it.
I am touched, deeply touched. Yeah. I'm gonna put that on my mirror so I see it every morning when I get up and say, Richard prefers me to the dental drill.
Yeah, I didn't say how much I prefer you, but
it doesn't. I don't need to know.
Could be a close.
Hey, it's a win's a win, Richard, by a minute, by
well,
inch
you're
or a
talking
mile.
to a Sabre fan.
Yeah,
I know.
You know all about near wins or barely wins. Well, today we talk about leadership here, despite our ramblings here, but. As we've said recently, and we've always said this, but leadership ultimately boils down to people, and you're leading people, not an organization per se, or you're not just doing your task. That's maybe what managers do and what workers do, but when you move into leadership, it really comes down to people, and that's what matters. That's what will set your leadership apart from others, and part of that, I think, is surrounding yourself with people of diverse backgrounds, diverse thought, and making your circle of influencers push you some, and it not just be a bunch of people who say yes to you. And we've highlighted the dangers of being surrounded by a bunch of sycophants. But we want to look at the model of Jesus today and how he sort of designed, if you will, his leadership team through the disciples.
Yeah, and I think the point we really want to make today is that our leadership and even our character can be influenced so much by the people that we engage with. And so, if you are constantly surrounding yourself with wise people, you're gonna have some of that wisdom rub off on you. And if you're around courageous people who stand up for what's right, you're probably going to do some of that as well. So if you're going to gain, hopefully, good things from the people you're around, then obviously the wider variety of people you're around, if you can be pulling what's good from them, you're going to have more input into your character, into your leadership. But I think we've seen, certainly in recent days, that we have a lot of tribes out there, a lot of people that all congregate together because they see things exactly the same way. And they all sort of chant the same party line, and everybody says amen and claps. And everybody feels like they're a genius because no one disagrees with them. And then, but there's huge blind spots. They're pretty soft in some areas because they've never been challenged to have to sharpen themselves in that area. And so Uh, so I think that one of the things I think leaders just have to do is to be constantly trying to find ways to diversify the people that they're around. And that doesn't mean that your best friend is a polar opposite of you, but you do need to have people in your life who aren't just like you, that really stretch you and you know, may upset you sometimes because but they make you think. And so and there's two ways that typically as a leader you're going to have people like that in your life. Some is going to be because you inherit them. It's you go to work and they work there too. So you made the leader of an organization, and now your direct reports have some people in them that really rub you the wrong way, and you've got to decide, what am I going to do about that? Another thing that's good about having people different than you is that you have to learn how to lead different kinds of people, and you can't just lead one way and get the same results from everybody. And so one of the ways is just you inherit them, and if that's the case, I know some leaders who basically say, well, if you're not like me and seeing things the way I do, then here's the door. You know, we'll clean you out. And yet I would encourage leaders to say, if that person's not just trying to oppose you, if they're not rebellious, they're just different, then maybe see their existence in your orbit of life as an opportunity for you to learn how to lead a different kind of person and maybe learn from that person. But then secondly, you can always choose to get people in your world. You can hire them. You can choose to spend time with them as friends. You could just meet with them periodically and just spend time with people, asking them questions. And of course, that's a great way where you just intentionally say, you know, I don't know if any of my friends are, you know, Democrat or Republican or the Buffalo Sabres fan or you know,
it's because there's only two, you and your son.
And so, and you know, and to say, so I would like just to have at least someone in my world that is kind of leans that way and sees things that way, because they'll help me. So, but I thought that we might just begin by looking at Jesus. That's never a bad place to look as a leader. But of course, what he does is very interesting because he comes to earth and he is essentially trying to start the largest movement in world history, the largest organization, the kingdom of God, Christianity, that has over, I think, like 3 billion or more followers, and churches all around the world and so on. And he's going to start a movement, and Jesus is only going to be on the earth for 3.5 years. So in 3.5 years, he's got to establish a group of people that he can lead. And even when the Roman Empire tries to squelch it and persecute it and pressure it out of existence, how can you, in 3.5 years, come up with an organization that the Emperor Nero can't destroy when he's running things? So, you know, the question would be, so then if your father, the boss, said, okay, you can pick 12 men, 12 people, and pour yourself into those 12 in particular, and build this movement on those 12 people. And just to kind of make it interesting, have one of those people, a traitor that will backstab you and sell you out at one point. So you really only have 11 people that will be around. So what kind of people would you pick if you're told, go out there and look at this crowd of people, and then maybe your father says, and Jesus, I want you to go out to the backwater, to the Hicks, to the sticks of Galilee, not into the urban center, not into the biggest city, not where all the powerful business people, political people, and not the religious scholars, like they're all down in Jerusalem. You go up into the hinterland and pick from those people. And so incredibly challenging. And so, of course, when you look at the disciples, a lot of people have analyzed the disciples of Jesus. And of course, he has 12. And there's actually, when people have studied this, there are 3 sets of 4 disciples. You can break the disciples into thirds. and there's 3 groups of 4. And of course, between the various Gospels, a couple of the disciples go by different names, like a Bartholomew or someone, or Thaddeus, or there's some that will be called Judas, or not Judas Iscariot, but the other Judas. And so there's 2 Jameses, and so some of the names are. It doesn't mean that there's mistakes there, errors. It just means that some of the gospel, like Luke, is written by a Gentile, and so he may use primarily a Greek name for someone, and Matthew might use the Jewish name and that kind of thing, or some of the names might be actually a family name and not their first name, and so on. But anyway, that aside, there's 3 sets of 4 names. And so let me just walk us through a couple of those for a moment, just to kind of get a sense of that. Of course, the first one, and by the way, there's also 4 different places in the Gospels and in the book of Acts where all 12 disciples are named. There's 4 lists. And Acts, I forget which gospel doesn't have it. It might be John. But the other 3 Gospels and Acts have a list, and they're not the same. Some of like I said, some of the names are a little bit different, but they still kind of follow the same order. And so, of course, the big 4 are always Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Those 4 are always in all 4 lists. Those 4 always are the top of the list, and Peter's always the top of that list. And of course, Peter's the most outspoken person. He sees himself as a leader. He wants to lead. Next to Jesus, no one in the Gospels is mentioned as often as Peter. Next to Jesus, no one's talking as much as Peter. No one gets rebuked by Jesus as much as Peter. Peter's the only one that has the gall to try to rebuke Jesus of the 12 disciples. And there's a lot to be said about Peter that can frustrate you. And as a leader, if you've ever had a group of people you were leading and you had one person that was always answering the questions, always speaking up right away, you can sort of think, okay, do I need someone like that? And especially if they're challenging your decisions and telling you things that they don't think you should do. And he, of course, Peter tended to exaggerate stuff. I mean, to say, I will never do this. Everyone else may fail you, but I never will. And so, but one thing I would just say about that, and of course we could spend a whole podcast just on Peter, but one thing about him is he had passion. Yeah. And what I've found is it is far easier to curb passion than to try to to instill passion. Yeah. Better to have zeal and enthusiasm and then try to help give some sense of self-control over that than have someone with no passion and you're trying to light a fire. So Jesus, I think, saw the passion in Peter and realized he had the patience to say, okay, he does mean well and he does want to do well. He's got some stuff that needs some curbing, but he's worth having on the team. And then, of course, there's James, and some people feel like James might have been the oldest or one of the older disciples. And of course, James and John appear to come from a fairly successful family. They have a successful fishing business. They have servants, and so they must have some success. And James, it appears, is the older brother of John. There's some thought that they might be cousins with Jesus, and so they would have a lot of inroads. And so if you're James, and you may be the oldest of the disciples, you're the oldest sibling, kind of psyche, you come from a fairly successful family, then you would sort of assume that you would be the leader, one of the leaders in the group. And maybe you're not as outspoken as Peter, but it is interesting that when King Herod decides to martyr the first disciple, he actually martyrs James. James is the first one to get killed. They don't arrest Peter first or John. They arrest and kill James. So that that tells me that he may have been perceived as an early leader among the 12. Of course, he tried to negotiate to sit at the right hand and the left hand with John around Jesus, so ambitious as well. He's the only one of those inner circle folks. In some sense, you've got several of those. Like you've got some of the disciples, like Matthew writes his own gospel, and John writes his own gospel. But James, we never really hear much from because, of course, he dies early, so he doesn't ever write his gospel. And then you've got Andrew, and his name actually means manly. So, I mean, you could have been called Andrew. Is that your middle name? I forget now.
No,
David,
no.
I think. Yeah. So, but it means
Could be though.
It means manly, but I've thought lots about Andrew because he's out of those four, he's the one that doesn't get included in the inner circle, and but he never complains about it. The other. His brothers in the inner circle, his cousins, his good friends, business partners, James and John are in the inner circle. But he accepts his role, and Andrew's the guy who's always bringing people to Jesus.
Right.
And in fact, he brings Peter to Jesus. He was following Jesus before Peter was. And he must have known, if I bring my domineering, outspoken older brother into this group, he's going to take over. I found this group first. But if I bring my brother, he'll take over and be in charge like he always does. But he did anyway. He loved his brother, and he just kept his ego out of the way. And so, I found that with good teams, you need some people that will speak up, and you need people that will step up to be to take a lead if you need. But you also just need those folks that are the team players that just care about the team and not about their accolades and so on. And then there's John. He's probably the youngest of the disciples. In his writings, of course, he talks a lot about love. He's seems to be quite affectionate. He's laying his head against Jesus' breast in the Last Supper. He seems to be a person that really loved Jesus. He's also pretty courageous. He's all the rest of the disciples run into the night when Jesus is arrested, and John is there standing before the cross. He's young enough that he doesn't fear as much that he'll be arrested or mistreated. But so those are the four, and you've got a kind of a caring, loving person. You've got an outspoken person. You've got a team guy. You might have an older kind of wizened guy that kind of has a lot of influence, even if you don't always see it. And then you got the next tier, the next group, and that typically involves Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew. And those four, sometimes it's not always in the same order, but those four are always going to be in the second tier. And Philip, I think, is always at the top of that list. And Philip is kind of his name actually means lover of horses. And apparently he came from Bethsaida, which is where Peter and Andrew came from. And in fact, a lot of people speculate that Thomas and Nathaniel, Philip, were all fishermen, as well as Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So maybe 7 of the disciples were fishermen from the Sea of Galilee, and they all would have known each other. So in fact, James, the first 4 are partners. And so it's not like Jesus necessarily just intentionally made sure everybody was completely different. He hires 2 sets of brothers, and it appears that there may several, maybe even 3 of these disciples may have been cousins to Jesus, and so that also says something. He has a variety. All 11 of the disciples are from Galilee. The only one who's not from the northern part is Judas. Judas is the only one that comes from farther south in Judea. And I could say a lot about several of the others. Philip tends to say the wrong things, and he seems to be the one that is counting, doing the numbers and the math, and when Jesus is going to try to feed the 5,000, it's Philip. He asks, how much money do you think this would take, Philip? What would it take to feed all these people? And he has an answer. It's going to take over 200 denarii would not be enough. And And so he's one of these guys that has to grow, that he's not a big thinker early on. And maybe that's not bad to have one or two in the group that's got their calculator out saying,
maybe
okay,
call themselves a realist or
and
pragmatic.
here's the numbers. And of course there's Thomas as well. And Thomas is, it seems like he's kind of he's like an Eeyore kind of character in some ways. Most of the time when he says something is kind of negative as well. He's, when he's at one point when Jesus is going to go back down to Jerusalem, he says, well, let's go with him and die with him. Yeah. It's like, okay, thanks, Thomas. That was really an inspiring word. And then at one point Jesus is talking about, the way, he says, well, how do we know the way? And of course that prompts Jesus to say, well, he is the way, the truth, and the life, and so on. And then Nathaniel is, he's the one that's known as he's the one without any guile. He's got basically a lot of integrity. And some of these guys, like in the Gospel of John tells us about Philip and Nathaniel following Jesus, but then we don't hear a lot from some of these, like Nathaniel afterward. He's kind of quiet. And I really kind of take some comfort in that out of 12 people, they're not all superstars. They're not all Peters.
Yeah.
There's some that just quietly are part of the team. And apparently they must have done the job. There are traditions that say that 11 of these guys, everybody except John, was martyred, that they scattered all over the world. Tradition says that Thomas went as far as India, was martyred there. Like they went quite a ways. They all got scattered into different parts of the world, and they all served the Lord faithfully their whole life. But some, like Nathaniel, we don't know very much about him. Just that he apparently Jesus said we need folks like that. And I mean, some of our listeners, you may not be the guy that's always behind the microphone or gives the really fiery speeches at the year-end report, town hall, but you may just be doing your job well where you are and faithfully and getting stuff done, and you may never have a bio written up on you, but your organization is better because you're there and because you do what you're called to do. And then the last four. And some of these, their names may differ, but one is just James, the son of Alphaeus. He's different than the James, brother of John. And some actually have speculated that his mother may have been sisters with Jesus' mother, Mary. You can't know that for sure, but some of the names kind of line up. And so that might be the case. He's known as James the Lesser. How would you like to have that kind of name? Like Sam really the Lesser.
Yeah.
I mean, when I try to lose weight, I like that. Richard says, Richard the Lesser, you've dropped a few pounds. It could just mean that he's younger. It could also mean he's smaller of stature. And I don't know what all they intended by that, but to say James the Lesser, that might have been a derogatory term for a man in that day. Like lessers, probably it's hard to think of a way in which that's like a compliment. And if you've got kind of a domineering James in the group that's in the inner circle, and you're James the Lesser, and yet again Jesus knew that you didn't need 12 James like James the More. you needed some of the lesser. And then, of course, interestingly, you've got, we did mention Matthew, but he's in the second group. And, of course, he's a tax collector. He's like the lowest of the scum in that generation, that age. And
would not necessarily have been a friend of
he would have been
the fishermen.
Yeah, like that's one that would have just raised a lot of eyebrows. So when they would have looked and said, "What, you got all these fishermen, like those uncouth, untrained fishermen, like what kind of team do you have there?" But then when they saw Matthew, they would say, "Well, you've got a guy like a notorious sinner, a guy that's like, how can we take your team seriously?" But, I have a feeling that I can only speculate because the Bible doesn't say, but he obviously had a lot of friends because he throws a party after he starts following Jesus, and it's full of tax collectors and sinners. So he must have been popular and had a lot of contacts. And I just wonder if wherever they traveled, if Matthew didn't know some of the kind of sleazier people, like, I think I can get you what you need, Jesus. I got a friend, I can imagine Matthew saying,
guy on that mountain.
Yeah, I know a guy. Probably he said that in about every town they went to. But, and yet Jesus used that. And I would not be surprised if I learned that his contacts often perhaps helped out with the cause, in the days to come. But then you've got Simon the Zealot, and he's always in the third group, along with James the Lesser. And, of course, the Zealot was a radical. He was there's no hope for this society. Let's burn it down. And these Zealots eventually became known as people that, eventually they're the ones who are going to lead the revolt against Rome, and that's going to cause Rome to come in and
burn the city down,
destroy the temple, tear down the walls, scatter the Jews for almost 2,000 years. It's going to be zealots just like Simon. He gets out of that movement a couple of decades before it gets really red hot, but he's in that group, he's in that mindset. And some of the first people that zealots would have wanted to kill would be tax collectors. And so I've always wondered how Matthew and Simon got along there.
What was that introduction like?
Because they would have hated each other. They would have just hated each other at the outset. And later, zealots, what they would do is they had these kind of curved knives that they would carry concealed, and then they would kind of walk up next to a target and stab them to death, and then just disappear into the crowd. And that's what zealots would do. They were hitmen, and they would murder, assassinate people that they thought were sellouts. And so the tax collectors would have been the first people to go.
Yeah.
And so you've got them right on Jesus' team. And for him, I just would have thought, okay, Jesus, either call a tax collector or call a zealot, but you don't want to be, every meeting it's going to break down, or they're going to look at each other funny, or and then there's another Judas, the son of James. He has other names he goes by as well. Again, we don't really know anything more hardly about him, that there's his name. And Judas means Jehovah, or God leads, which is ironic because that's also Judas Iscariot's name. And like I said, Judas Iscariot is the only one from the southern part of Judah. All the rest are from Galilee. And so all the other disciples may well have known each other. They might have gone to the same synagogue on Sabbath, and they would have seen each other. That place wasn't that big. The population wasn't that big. They would have probably all known each other to some level. But Judas would have been the outsider and the one that nobody really knew. And nobody, they might have their suspicions, although it doesn't appear that they did.
Yeah.
They would have just kind of written it off and said, oh, he's different. He's from the South. They do things differently down there. And he apparently never kind of fit in because he was there, but he never bought in. And apparently, of course, Jesus, his primary calling was to die, and Judas was going to be the instrument that brought that about. But so Judas had his purpose. I don't know that I would say everybody needs to have a traitor on their leadership team to be like Jesus, but but I would say sometimes some very unusual people may have a role, at least in your life. And so I see, Sam, we're already out of time, but we'll have to make this, I guess, a two-part discussion. But I am fascinated by the kind of team Jesus intentionally put together, and so that makes me look at our team. And I don't think you need to try to be politically correct and have every major ethnic group represented on your direct reports team and say, well, this guy's perfectly qualified, but we need someone of a different color or whatever, what ethnicity, whatever. I think you should try to have a variety of perspectives and backgrounds, for sure. And I think you might just want to look at just besides who you work with, just who you associate with, who you socialize with. Do you ever just intentionally spend time with folks who are different than you and say, help me understand this. Help me understand your culture. And I'm seeing a lot of this in the news right now. Just would you explain this to me? Just help me understand why you see things this way, why people of your political party persuasion or worldview or whatever else see things this way, because I'd love to learn. And I may not agree, but you know, I may learn, and it may actually help inform what I believe, because now I understand why some people don't hold those views. So lots to say about that, but I want to encourage our listeners, take an audit of, think of in your life and in your relationships, who are the people on the fringe, who are the most not like you, and are they that different? And I'm not talking about just people you might know, but I mean people that you choose to relate to and interact with. And if they're not all that different than you, maybe that would be a good challenge to go a little farther afield and intentionally maybe cultivate a relationship with someone. So not that you can necessarily change them, but so you can learn from them.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly living in an age of echo chambers, and I think one of the most beneficial things anyone can do is try and break out and first of all recognize that if you are in one, and set yourself free from that by reaching out to people who aren't like you. So with that, we will leave it there, and we'll probably come back with a part 2 of this discussion.
Sounds good.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.